The subway car rattled through the underground tunnels, the dim fluorescent lights flickering overhead with every jolt of the train. Keanu Reeves sat near the end of the carriage, his face partially hidden beneath the brim of a simple baseball cap, a worn hoodie pulled over his head. He wasn't in the spotlight today. No red carpets, no flashing cameras, just another commuter blending into the sea of weary travelers. For a rare moment, he felt unseen. It was a luxury. No whispers of recognition, no hurried requests for selfies. Just the steady hum of the train and the rhythmic clatter of the tracks beneath his feet. The smell of old metal, faint traces of spilled coffee, and the musty air of too many bodies packed into a small space filled the car. Keanu exhaled softly, sinking deeper into his seat, letting himself enjoy the rare anonymity. But peace never lasted long. At the next station, a flood of new passengers entered. Among them, a young man in a gray hoodie pulled low over his face, his sharp eyes scanning the crowd with restless energy. Keanu noticed him immediately. The way his gaze darted around the car, the nervous twitch of his fingers, he had seen this kind of energy before. It was the kind that spelled trouble. Then the young man's gaze locked onto something, or rather, someone. An elderly woman, probably in her late 60s, carefully stepped inside, clutching a large, overstuffed handbag against her chest. She moved with the slow, deliberate steps of someone carrying both years and burdens. Her shoes were old, slightly worn at the heels, and her hands trembled just slightly as she tried to steady herself against the rocking motion of the train. Keanu observed as she glanced around, looking for a seat. But no one moved to offer her one. People avoided eye contact, some pretending to be too engrossed in their phones, others just staring blankly at the walls. The old woman sighed, disappointment flashing briefly in her eyes. Keanu was about to stand up. He would have gladly given her his seat, but before he could, the young man in the hoodie made his move. At first, Keanu thought he might be offering assistance, but then the young man sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. "Move it, Grandma." His words cut through the otherwise quiet car, sharp and unkind. The elderly woman hesitated, confusion flickering across her face. She tried to step around him, but he shifted to block her path. "I said move," the young man repeated, his tone more forceful this time. He gave her a light shove, not enough to knock her over, but enough to make a statement. A few passengers let out quiet gasps. Others simply looked away. A couple of them smirked, as if this were some sort of twisted entertainment. One man, sitting across from Keanu, chuckled under his breath. Keanu's jaw tightened. His hands clenched into fists beneath his hoodie. He had spent years playing characters who stood up for the helpless, men who fought injustice on the screen. But this wasn't a movie. This was real, and no one was doing anything. The young man grinned, turning toward the onlookers like he was performing. "Look at this old lady, carrying her whole life in that ugly bag. What's in there, huh? Rocks?" He laughed, a few others chuckling nervously with him. Keanu's fingers twitched. He wanted to move, to act, but he waited. Maybe someone else would step in first. Maybe someone else would do what was right, but no one did. The old woman, Clara, as Keanu would later learn, held her bag tighter, determined to ignore him. But the young man wasn't done. He stepped closer, invading her space. "Where do you think you're going, huh?" he taunted. Then, without warning, he grabbed her handbag and yanked it from her grasp. She gasped, her frail hands reaching for it, but he held it high above her, out of reach. "Oh, now you got something to say?" he mocked. The car was silent, save for the sound of the train rushing through the tunnel. Then Keanu stood up. The motion was quiet, controlled, but it carried a weight that immediately shifted the atmosphere in the car. People who had previously ignored the scene now turned their heads, their attention drawn to him, not because they recognized him, but because of the sheer presence he carried. "That's enough," Keanu said, his voice calm, but firm. The young man turned, startled. He sized up the newcomer, his smirk faltering for just a second. "And who the hell are you, old man?" he scoffed. Keanu pulled back his hoodie just slightly, allowing his face to be seen for the first time. Recognition flickered in the young man's eyes, followed by a split second of uncertainty. "Give it back," Keanu said simply. The entire car fell into a hush. Even those who had been recording the incident lowered their phones slightly. The young man hesitated, glancing around at the other passengers as if expecting someone to back him up. But no one did. Even the ones who had laughed earlier suddenly found their shoes very interesting. "Man, it's just a joke," the young man muttered. He crouched down, setting the bag on the floor, then raised his hands in mock surrender. "See? No harm done." Keanu didn't move. "Apologize," he said, his voice still calm, but carrying the weight of a command. The young man scowled. "What?" "I said, apologize." The young man swallowed. He looked around again, but there was no escape. Finally, through gritted teeth, he muttered, "Sorry." "Louder," Keanu said. The young man clenched his jaw. His hands balled into fists at his sides, but he knew he had lost. "I said I'm sorry," he barked. Keanu didn't break eye contact. He let the words hang in the air, making sure they meant something. Then, after a long pause, he finally nodded. Clara bent down, shakily retrieving her bag. She clutched it close to her chest, her fingers still trembling. She looked up at Keanu, her eyes filled with quiet gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. Keanu gave her a small nod. No words were needed, but this wasn't over yet. "Get on the ground," Keanu ordered. The young man's face went pale. "What?" Keanu's eyes remained steady. "Hands behind your head. Now." A bead of sweat formed on the young man's temple. He glanced toward the doors, contemplating whether to make a run for it, but something in Keanu's expression told him that wouldn't end well. Slowly, reluctantly, he lowered himself onto the floor. His hands went behind his head. Keanu turned to the rest of the passengers. "Call the police," he said. No one moved at first. Then, finally, a few people scrambled for their phones. A man in a suit muttered into his device, "Yeah, we need officers at the next station." Clara exhaled shakily, tears brimming in her eyes. Keanu stayed where he was, standing over the young man, making sure he didn't move. Outside, the lights of the approaching station flickered into view, and Keanu knew, the world was about to find out what had happened. The subway screeched as it pulled into the next station, the heavy metal doors sliding open with a dull hiss. The young man remained on the ground, his hands behind his head, his breathing uneven. Keanu stood over him, his expression unreadable, but his presence alone kept the situation under control. Passengers sat frozen, their phones in hand, some recording, others pretending not to. The same people who had laughed at the old woman's misfortune minutes ago now kept their heads down, as if ashamed to have witnessed the events at all. Then, heavy footsteps echoed from the platform outside. Two uniformed police officers stepped onto the train, their sharp eyes scanning the car. It didn't take them long to spot the young man on the floor, nor to recognize the tension in the air. The taller officer, a broad-shouldered man with graying hair, took a step forward. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice steady but firm. Keanu kept his gaze on the young man. "This one tried to rob an elderly woman," he said evenly, gesturing toward Clara. "Shoved her, grabbed her bag. I stopped him." The officers exchanged a glance. The second officer, a younger man with sharp eyes, pulled out a notepad. "Ma'am," he said gently, turning to Clara. "Is this true?" Clara, still gripping her handbag as if it might vanish again, nodded. "Yes," she said, her voice steady now. "He took my bag. If it weren't for him," she glanced at Keanu, her gaze filled with quiet gratitude. "I don't know what would have happened." The taller officer sighed, stepping toward the young man. "All right. On your feet." The young man hesitated, but one sharp look from Keanu made him comply. He slowly pushed himself up, hands still in the air. "Turn around," the officer instructed. The young man scowled but obeyed, and a second later, the cold metallic click of handcuffs echoed through the subway car. The officer patted him down quickly before gripping his arm. "You got anything to say for yourself?" The young man sneered. "Man, this is stupid," he muttered. "It was just a joke." Keanu finally turned to face him, his expression calm, but the intensity in his eyes never wavered. "No," he said simply. "It wasn't." For a moment, the young man looked like he wanted to argue. His lips parted, his body tensed, but then he glanced around. He saw the passengers watching him, the cameras still pointed in his direction, the officers tightening their grip. His bravado faded. "Whatever," he muttered. The officers didn't waste any more time. They led him toward the doors, stepping off the train and onto the platform. Before they disappeared, the younger officer turned back. "We'll need a statement," he said to Clara. She nodded. "Of course." The train doors closed with a hiss, locking the rest of the passengers inside as the subway lurched forward once more. The tension in the car didn't immediately dissipate. People shifted awkwardly, some stealing glances at Keanu, others at Clara. Then, finally, a soft voice broke the silence. "Thank you," Clara said, looking directly at Keanu. Keanu turned his gaze toward her, the hard edge in his expression softening. "You don't have to thank me," he said quietly. Clara smiled, small but warm. "Oh, but I do." She patted her bag as if reassuring herself that it was still there. "Not many people would have done what you did. Most would have just watched." Keanu glanced around the car. He saw the passengers who had done exactly that, sat in silence, watching, recording, but never stepping in. Some of them looked away when his eyes met theirs. He exhaled, leaning back into his seat. "Maybe next time," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. "They won't just watch." Clara chuckled, shaking her head. "You're an optimist, aren't you?" Keanu smirked slightly. "Not really." She studied him for a moment, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You look familiar," she mused, tilting her head. "I swear I've seen you before." Keanu pulled the brim of his cap lower. "Just got one of those faces." Clara's knowing smile widened. Sure you do." The subway continued rattling forward, but the mood had shifted. The fear was gone, the tension eased, but something else had taken its place, an unspoken understanding. A moment shared between those who had been there, who had seen what had happened. But then, it happened. A man a few seats down glanced up from his phone, his eyes widening slightly. He nudged the person next to him. Then another. The whispers started. "Wait a second, is that Keanu Reeves?" Keanu sighed inwardly. He knew this part all too well. A teenage girl gasped, pulling out her phone. "Oh my God, it is him." The same people who had just moments ago been bystanders were now scrambling for their cameras, their excitement palpable. Keanu rubbed a hand over his face, and just like that, his anonymity was gone. The shift in energy was almost instant. The subway car, which had been heavy with awkward silence just moments ago, now buzzed with excitement. Passengers who had pretended not to see anything before were suddenly sitting up straighter, whispering to each other, eyes flicking toward Keanu like he was some rare sighting in the wild. The teenage girl who had gasped earlier lifted her phone, her fingers hovering over the screen. "Oh my God," she whispered to her friend. "Should I ask for a selfie?" Her friend, equally starstruck, nudged her excitedly. Do it before he gets off." A man in his 30s, dressed in a suit, gave Keanu an apologetic look before leaning in. "Hey man, sorry to bother you, but, you're Keanu Reeves, right?" Keanu sighed through his nose, his hand still resting over his face for a second before he slowly lowered it. He gave the man a tired but polite nod. "Yeah." The teenage girl let out a barely contained squeal. "I knew it." She turned to her friend, shaking her by the arm. "It's really him." The moment the confirmation was out in the open, people reacted like they had just been granted permission to speak. "Dude, I love your movies." You're a legend, man. John Wick in real life, huh? Keanu had heard it all before. The admiration, the excitement, it came with the territory. Normally, he didn't mind it. He appreciated his fans. But today was different. The whole reason he had taken the subway in the first place was to be just another face in the crowd, to move through the world unnoticed for a little while. And for a brief, fleeting moment, he had been invisible. But not anymore. A phone screen lit up in his peripheral vision. Someone had started recording, then another and another. Keanu exhaled slowly, adjusting his cap. The man in the suit gave him a sheepish grin. I hate to ask, but, could I get a quick picture? Before Keanu could respond, Clara, who had been sitting quietly through all of this, suddenly let out a loud, amused chuckle. Oh, now y'all interested, she said, shaking her head. She adjusted her handbag on her lap and gave the crowd a pointed look. Wasn't nobody paying attention when I was getting pushed around a few minutes ago? But now? She scoffed playfully. Now y'all wanna be best friends? The sudden call-out was like cold water splashing over the passengers. A few people shuffled awkwardly, their excitement faltering just a little. The teenage girl lowered her phone, looking mildly embarrassed. The man in the suit rubbed the back of his neck. Keanu turned to Clara, the corner of his lips twitching in amusement. She met his gaze with a knowing smile. I got you, baby, she said, patting his knee lightly. He chuckled. Appreciate that. For a moment, there was a pause, then the subway intercom crackled to life. Next stop, Lexington Station. Doors will open on the right. Keanu took that as his cue. He stood up, stretching his legs slightly. The train was slowing down, the platform coming into view. The teenage girl, still holding her phone, hesitated for a second before calling out, Mr. Reeves? Keanu glanced at her, eyebrows raised. She bit her lip, then said, more genuinely this time, that was really cool, what you did back there. The murmurs of excitement in the car quieted. A few people nodded in agreement. It was one thing to see a celebrity. It was another to realize you had just witnessed something that actually mattered. Keanu gave her a small, grateful nod. Thanks. The train came to a stop with a lurch. The doors hissed open. Keanu turned to Clara one last time. You take care of yourself, all right? She smiled warmly. I always do, sweetheart. Then, without another word, he stepped out onto the platform. The cool subway air hit him, and for a second, he just stood there, hands in his pockets, listening to the sounds of the city rumbling above. Behind him, the doors slid shut. The train rumbled to life again, carrying Clara and the rest of the passengers into the tunnel. Keanu exhaled, rolling his shoulders. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He knew what it was before he even checked. By now, the internet would be buzzing. Someone, somewhere, had already uploaded the video. The headlines were probably forming as he stood there. He sighed, and then, he walked away. Keanu stepped onto the subway platform, pulling his hoodie a little lower over his face as he moved toward the exit. The echoes of the train's departure rumbled behind him, fading into the tunnels. The cool, artificial air of the underground station brushed against his skin as he walked up the stairs, emerging into the city above. He could already feel it. The shift, somewhere out there, the world was waking up to the story. Someone had already posted the video, maybe multiple people. It would spread like wildfire, and by the time he reached wherever he was headed, his phone would be flooded with calls, messages, notifications. He took it out of his pocket, the screen lighting up with an onslaught of unread texts. Manager, Keanu, call me. Now, publicist, we need to get ahead of this. You're already trending, old friend, dude. I just saw the video. That was insane, Keanu sighed, locking the screen without responding. He knew how this worked. The media machine had already started turning its gears. He pulled up his hood and kept walking, blending into the flow of pedestrians. The streets of New York pulsed with life, honking taxis, the hum of conversation, distant sirens wailing. People bustled past him, each in their own world, unaware that a piece of news was unfolding just below their feet. For a brief moment, he was alone with his thoughts. Then, a voice broke through the city noise. "Hey, hey! Wait, you are." Keanu turned his head slightly. A young man, probably in his 20s, stood on the sidewalk holding his phone up. His eyes were wide, a grin spreading across his face. "Dude, I just saw the video, like, 2 minutes ago." "That was you, right?" The guy laughed, shaking his head in disbelief. "That was crazy, man. You're a real-life action hero." Keanu gave him a tight-lipped smile, nodding but saying nothing. "You mind if I?" The man gestured toward his phone, already positioning it for a selfie. Keanu exhaled slowly. "Not right now, man." The guy hesitated, then nodded, looking a little embarrassed. Yeah, of course. I get it. Just, man, respect." He gave Keanu a small, appreciative nod before stepping back into the crowd. Keanu kept walking. This was how it always happened. He had been through it before, so many times. A moment of normalcy, then a viral clip, then the world watching. It never took long, but this time was different. This wasn't a movie premiere. This wasn't a scripted stunt or a planned press moment. This was just him doing what any decent person should have done. And now, it was a spectacle. A large digital billboard flickered above a storefront ahead, playing a news segment. Keanu wouldn't have paid it any mind, except he caught a glimpse of something familiar, his own face. His heart sank slightly as he saw the headline, "Keanu Reeves, real-life hero? Hollywood star stops subway robbery in viral video." He stopped for just a second, staring up at the screen as the clip played, a shaky, grainy phone recording capturing the exact moment he had stood up to the thief. The audio was muffled, but the tension in the car was still palpable. Even through the low-quality footage, the news anchor's voiceover played. In an unbelievable real-life moment, actor Keanu Reeves stepped in to stop a robbery on a New York subway train. The internet is already exploding with reactions, with many calling him a real-life John Wick. Keanu groaned under his breath. That was the last thing he wanted. He turned away and kept walking, tuning out the sound of his own name being broadcasted to the city. Minutes later, he ducked into a small coffee shop, hoping for a moment of quiet. The barista looked up as he entered, her eyes widening slightly before she quickly schooled her expression. Hi," she said, flustered. "What can I get you?" Keanu gave her a small smile. "Just a black coffee, please." She nodded quickly, stealing another glance at him as she worked. By the time she handed him his cup, her hands were trembling slightly. You're all over the news," she blurted. Keanu sighed, taking the coffee. "Yeah, I figured." The barista hesitated. "Sorry, that was really cool, what you did." Keanu studied her for a moment before giving her a small, tired nod. "Thanks." He turned, taking a seat near the window, staring out at the city as he took a slow sip of his coffee. The world was watching. Again, and no matter how much he wanted to disappear, he knew it was already too late. Keanu sat in the quiet corner of the coffee shop, his fingers wrapped around the warm cup, staring out at the city beyond the window. The world outside carried on as usual, people rushing to work, taxis honking impatiently, the endless rhythm of life in New York. But somewhere out there, his name was spreading across screens, flashing in headlines, bouncing between conversations. His phone buzzed again. He ignored it. He had spent his entire career in the public eye, but this was different. This wasn't about a movie role, a red carpet, or a press tour. It was a simple moment, one where he had done what any decent person should have done. And yet, it had turned into a viral sensation, another spectacle for the world to dissect, analyze, and turn into entertainment. He sighed, rubbing his hand over his face. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw movement. An elderly woman had entered the coffee shop. For a split second, his mind flashed back to Clara on the subway, clutching her bag, fear in her eyes as she tried to hold her ground. But this wasn't Clara. This woman, dressed in a long beige coat, shuffled toward the counter with careful steps, her small hands counting out coins from a worn wallet. The barista was patient, but Keanu could see the line behind her growing restless, people checking their watches, shifting on their feet. Keanu didn't think. He just moved. He stood, walked to the counter, and before the woman could hand over her last few coins, he gently placed a bill on the counter. "I've got it," he said simply. The woman blinked up at him in surprise. "Oh, it's on me," he said with a small smile. "Enjoy your coffee." She hesitated for only a moment before returning his smile, her eyes warm. "Well, aren't you sweet?" she said softly. Keanu nodded, stepping back to let her order. The barista shot him a look of quiet admiration, but she didn't say anything. As he turned to leave, the woman called after him, "Thank you, young man." He paused at the door, then turned slightly, giving her a small nod. "No need to thank me," he said. "Just pass it on." And with that, he stepped out into the city, disappearing into the crowd. No cameras, no flashes, no headlines, just another quiet moment, and this time, no one was watching.